Hello and welcome. This is the first of our scheduled topics on plant diversity. So focus on naming specific groups of flowering plants. And it's kind of a hairy effort to try and kind of put the boundaries on some of these groups. Some groups are easier to identify than others. Some are downright challenging, and it's going to be hard for me to convey exactly how to tell them apart, but we try to focus on the ones that are pretty easy to identify if you know what to look for. So that'll be the emphasis here. We're going to focus on names. So we'll be going through names of categories, specifically at the family level, and then sometimes at the genus level. So in the plant taxonomy class, sometimes I will ask you to be able to tell me the family that a particular species belongs to if I describe it to you, or if I show you a photo that has some distinctive images of that family. You'll be able to identify the family. In other cases, you'll identify the genus. And again, this is kind of tailored to what I think is the easiest way to learn these. So sometimes the family is very memorable, as with the plant that's pictured here. Other times the family itself is not so memorable, but the genus might be. And this is, again, also geared way toward plants you can find in Wisconsin. So we have plenty of abundance of aquatic plants, and that'll be the topic today. This is a topic near and dear to my heart. If I was to say that I specialize on any plant group, I would say that I specialize on aquatic plants. So let's get into it here. This is one of our aquatic plants. And being an aquatic plant, this means it lives in a watery habitat. So in open water with parts of the plant submerged, or in water soil that's covered with water. So sometimes we have plants that are emergent. So we'll get into that as we go. So what does it mean to be aquatic? You probably have a rough idea of this. Plants have a similar aquatic history, I guess, an evolutionary history from animals. So we have some aquatic plants that have always been in the water and some that have secondarily gotten there. I should clarify that, actually. So plants that have always been in the water, those are more in the group we would call algae. So green algae are close relatives to the land plants. And as far as the land plants that are in water, let me clarify that all of them, as far as we know, have made it into the water secondarily. So this is like a whale or a seal, if you want to use an animal example, animal that has ended up back in the water after having ancestors that were on land. So living in the water, and then also potentially living in soil, as I've illustrated over here, living in soil that's underwater. And all of these present certain kinds of challenges and certain kinds of opportunities. So from an evolutionary standpoint, very exciting, very interesting topic. The challenges versus the opportunities. So the opportunities, you can kind of imagine abundant water is one of those. And the challenges are just like an animal, plant tissues underwater, they need to be able to breathe. So they need access to oxygen, same as an animal tissue would. Okay, so I have the definition on here. Hydric soils, hydric, just a water-influenced soil, waterlogged, you might say. And then for convenience, they're often broken down, these aquatic plants, into the growth strategy that they have. So plants are called emergent if their roots are in the water or the lower part of the plant is in the water, but it's otherwise supporting itself upright out of the water. Those are emergent, they emerge from the water. Other ones that are underwater are submersed. Sometimes you'll see submersed or submerged, sometimes used interchangeably. This term submersed, I think, is more specific to plants that are always underwater. So if you submerge something, you take it from above water and put it in the water. But if you're submersed, that's under the water. It's a tiny detail. So you can have these plants that are entirely underwater and rooted to the substrate. Sometimes they're not rooted and simply free floating underwater. And then there's a special category of floating leaf, where the roots are rooted in the substrate and the leaves are floating on the water surface. And one that I didn't talk about yet, the surface floating, this is another strategy also, where the plant might have roots that are getting nutrients from the water, but they're not actually rooted in soil. And the plant itself is floating on the surface. So we'll focus on each of these individually, name some groups that belong in each of these categories, and focus on their ecological advantages and challenges. So we back up to just the broad topic of aquatic plants. This is a super fun topic to look at from the perspective of evolution. So how did all these different plants become aquatic? This is a perfect example of convergent evolution. So we have a clear advantage to moving into water. This is an area with abundant water. Water is sometimes challenging for plants to get, but in the aquatic environment, they are okay for water. But then, of course, as we'll see, they have some challenges also. So the clear benefit of being in an area with abundant water has driven lots of these different plant groups to end up in the water. So I've got a phylogeny of plants here at the level of order, and then I've just put a box around aquatic groups. So either a group that is entirely aquatic, such as the water lilies. This is an order of plants that's all aquatic. It's got that purple box around it, and a couple other ones here. And then some that have aquatic members. So sometimes it's sort of a one-off for a large group to have just one or two aquatic members, and other times it's a widespread phenomenon. And just a nice illustration of the diversity here. One of the things we'll focus on as far as getting into the water is this idea that most aquatic plants, as you can see from these illustrations, have their flowers above water. So getting into the water for their underwater tissues, their leaves, their roots, their stems, not such a big deal for the vegetative tissues, but reproduction, when it comes to flowering under the water or on the water is a super challenge. And some plants have figured it out, but mostly aquatic plants prefer just to open their flowers above water and be pollinated by the wind or animals. Okay, so advantages, disadvantages. We talked about abundant water. Water has nice physical properties of holding on to, it's a little bit more stable for temperature. For example, if you see a lake, lakes take a long time to ice over. So even though the world outside might be freezing, the lake takes a long time to become freezing. It's a little bit slower to heat up, slower to cool down. That's the property of water, and that makes for a more stable environment for the plants inside. You might have a temperature outside that's 90 degrees or hotter Fahrenheit, and the plants in the water are rarely at that kind of temperature. So temperature, there's a bit of a pH buffer, and also, of course, the abundant water. The abundance of sunlight is a nice issue to consider. So if plants can make it out into open water, where they have either leaves floating on the water surface or the whole plant is floating on the water surface, that largely brings them away from these taller plants that might be able to shade them. So trees typically rely on a little more stable soils. And so trees and shrubs that might otherwise shade out these plants are not able to grow too close to the water. And so this gives them a new opportunity for abundant sunlight. Sometimes that's sunlight is a challenge. Sunlight has to get down into the lower water levels if you're underwater. And depending on how turbid, how much stuff is sort of suspended in the water, there might be more or less light getting down to the lower levels. So if you have a high nutrient lake, for example, water doesn't penetrate very far because there's a lot of stuff inside of the water. All right, so advantages, challenges, I think we've covered those pretty well. Challenges I mentioned, so the issue of having access to basically atmospheric gases. So carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, oxygen for cellular respiration. These are both processes that plant cells have to go through. Plant cells underground, often they don't have access to light, obviously, and they're a little more heavy on needing to do cellular respiration. They're living tissues, they have to be alive, and they need energy. So underground in a terrestrial environment, the roots are generally doing cellular respiration to use their energy using sugar from the rest of the plant. And that process needs oxygen, as we've seen. So underwater, how do you do that process underwater in the absence of light and in the absence of oxygen? We'll see some strategies for that. This is an illustration of one way to measure the light penetration in a water body. This is called a Secchi disk. And it's a circular disk with a pattern on it, so you can see it as maximum contrast. It's got white areas and black areas. And one way to measure how turbid the water is, how much stuff is suspended in the water, is to drop this disc and take a measurement of how far down you can drop it before you can't see it anymore. So you can kind of see it here and kind of see it here, and then it disappears out of perception at whatever depth that is. Okay, so we're going to zoom in on these different groups one at a time, starting with the floating leaved aquatic plants. I think these are some of the more charismatic aquatic plants and ones that you're probably familiar with. And at their particular position in the water body, they occupy typically this position that's farther out in the water depth, gets them away from like the challenges of wave movement that might be pushing them around and churning up the water in that position. Also moves them away from competition from some of these emergent plants or maybe some shrubs that are in the shallow water area. And they grow out in this area that's deeper water, where they grow long petioles up to their leaves, and that gives them access to, in most cases, just direct sunlight. So pretty awesome advantage there. Abundant water, direct sunlight. And the challenge is that the leaves at the surface, they can have access to oxygen and carbon dioxide, but underwater, what do? So the underwater parts, actually, these plants have an interesting strategy where they can, without any kind of pumping or anything, they have channels of air to allow gas to move through the petioles, and interesting little differences in the tiny microscopic differences in how the cells are put together. The leaves, depending on their age, allow water or air in or out a little bit differently. And that causes a continuous airflow actually through the spongy stems of these leaves and then down through the spongy tissue of the roots. So they actually have strategies for kind of maintaining gas air spaces inside of their underwater tissues that allows them to make up for not being exposed directly to atmospheric gas. Here's some illustrations here. So this, what I was mentioning, air coming in, actually coming into younger leaves and flowing out of older leaves is the pattern that's been identified in some of these plants. And through moving down, all the way down into the rhizome and then back up to the other leaf, that creates a continuous air movement, allowing that gas exchange to happen. Other strategies, so I mentioned the airspace. This is a cross-section through a stem of a nymphoides plant, another one of these floating leaf plants. And all these spaces here, these would be airspace. So you can see the cells and then the airspace. And there's also these adaptations, these very rigid star-like structures that help to hold open these air passages. So to keep them from collapsing, they have a little bit of rigidity to them. But they're really just air channels to allow air to move through these plants. So through the stems, through the leaf petioles, and so on. And then let me highlight this over here. This is a cross section through a floating leaf of water lily. And typically plants, terrestrial plants would do their gas exchange through the lower leaf surface. But of course that is on the water. Not a good place to exchange gases. So instead they have these stomata, the pores for allowing carbon dioxide in. They have those on the upper surface. And the leaf here also shows a lot of that spongy tissue. So spongy tissue allows for air movement. And then also, as you might imagine, promotes buoyancy. So it keeps these leaves floating and allows air to move through them. Okay, so here we go. Here's our first plant family, and it's a little bit of a doozy to spell. This is a family called Nymphaeaceae. And as we saw before, this ACEAE, this is a formulaic standard ending that just tells us this is a plant family. We also saw the use of types. So a type genus for a family gives the family its name. And so this is a family named for the genus Nymphaea. And so I think that's where this sometimes gets confusing to spell. The genus name Nymphaea has this AEA already in the genus name. You can see it down here. Here's the genus Nymphaea. So to make the full family name, you go Nymphaea, sort of drop the A and then put the ACEAE on there. Nymphaeaceae is how we say that. Just got a little bit extra syllable. Practice using that. So it's not Nymphaeaceae, it's Nymphaeaceae. And there it is. This is one of those families that would be described as basal or early diverging. I used some images of this to show you an example of plants that have some of these early, kind of reminiscent of the first flowering plants features. So some to think about, maybe pause the video and check for yourself. Some ancestral type of features on here. We have many parts. So the perianth made of lots of organs. They're arranged in a spiral pattern. You don't really get it necessarily from this, but if you took if you peeled off these petals, you would see their attachment is in more of a spiral format. Lots of stamens. So again, many perianth parts, many stamens. These are what we think of as pretty ancestral features. There's one feature that is typically a basal feature that's not present here, which would be separate carpels. So in fact, this group has fused carpels. So we'll direct you up to the floral formula. Here we have the G for the carpels, the gynecium, and it's got a circle around it. That means they're fused together. And then the line there tells us that it's a superior ovary. So superior ovary of fused carpels, 3 to a bunch. And I've got some arrows on here highlighting some of those features you might look for a little bit more if you're trying to identify this family. So many petals, many stamens, and often many carpels fused together. In the flowers, this is a useful identifying feature. And then of course, this would go along with a plant that has floating leaves. So you're well on your way to identifying, I think. Okay, so just as I mentioned on the last one, this is showing some sections of those syncarpous gynecia. And this one here has the stamens removed, and you can see the spiral pattern of how those stamens were attaching on here. So these are scars for the stamens, moving up and kind of around the ovary there. And then these are some scars of the perianth, also in a little bit more compressed, but still kind of a spiral pattern. This is the species Nuphar. I got the text cut off there. Nuphar, Nuphar. One thing that I feel like I have to do a public service announcement on this. One thing of note is that in water lilies, the leaves and the flowers both emerge from the rhizome. So let me illustrate that here. So underwater rhizome, if you remember, that was an underwater stem. So it's technically a stem, but of course, along the length, it would be putting out roots. And then the leaves come up from the rhizome, kind of arrange on the water surface. And when a flower is made, it's on its own from the rhizome. So of course, this would be the water level up here. So the leaves go up to the water surface. The flowers also, on a very long pedicel, go up to the water surface, and they are supported above the water surface where they can be visited by animal pollinators. And I mentioned this should be a public service announcement because I can't even count how many times you see this kind of standardized water lily, right? So this is what you see in cartoons, and I've got kids, my kids' books are full of these. This idea that there's a flower in the middle of the leaf and these are like basically fused together. This is not the case. You might, in a every once in a while circumstance, this flower might be kind of caught in the notch between these two lobes on the leaf. But otherwise, they are independent, growing off on their own. So the vegetative part of this plant is a little more independent from the reproductive part than is often indicated. All right, tell your friends. So maybe you can see that a little bit from here. Here's a flower all off on its own from this species of Victoria. Here's another one, just leaves emerging from the central location, which would be the rhizome. This is pretty shallow water, so you can see everything heading back to where it's originated from. And then here, just sort of off and on, flowers kind of associated with the leaves, but more kind of haphazardly in between them than associated specifically with a leaf. All right. This plant over here, Victoria, this has a very large floating leaf. It's a plant native to the Amazon in South America. And they're so large, you can do one of these if you, I guess, trust your trust your ability to balance a child on there. They're also very spiky on the underside. So I don't know how they got this child on here, but good job to them. While we're talking about plants with floating leaves, this is a family that's not one you typically run into. It's pretty rare globally, but it's one that's dear to my heart, so I've got to mention it. This is a family called Menianthaceae, and it gets its name from this species Menianthes, which is actually an emergent wetland plant. And the reason I'm mentioning it among the floating leaf plants is it has this genus called Nymphoides. So Nymphoides, actually that name, the genus name, and the oides means that it looks like nymphia. So we've got floating leaves and flowers and floating leaves and flowers, but much different. These flowers typically have 5 petals. They're fused together. This is a much closer relative of sunflowers than it is to the other water lilies. So if you ever want to know more about Menianthaceae, I'd be happy to talk about it. Okay, so those were our floating leaf plants. Really just one that I want to cover, and that's a very diverse, well, not terribly diverse, but certainly abundant worldwide Nymphaceae. Moving on, we're going to look at plants that are surface floating plants. So again, advantages and challenges. When I think about advantages, one thing that we didn't talk about with the last group is the advantage of being rooted in the substrate. So if your roots are down here in the soil, you have access to soil nutrients. So soil nutrients, whatever's in the minerals of the soil, the organic matter of the soil, that's more direct access. How do you get your nutrients if your leaves are just hanging down into the water? Well, depending on the water, some water bodies are rather rich in nutrients. And floating leaf plants, they're able to take advantage of what's dissolved in the water. So even though they're not like surrounded by organic material or mineral nutrients, they can get some of those from the water and enough to sustain their existence. All these plants, they're going to be found in different habitats depending on what they need and whatever that habitat can provide. So I guess maybe a little more often in nutrient-rich water bodies, you find this kind of plant. And then, of course, they have access to sunlight, and they do have the ability to go pretty much as deep as the water goes. They don't have a need to be anchored in the substrate. So if you have a very large water body that's deep, depending, they tend not to cover really large water bodies. But if you had a still water lake, sometimes you see them pretty well covered by this kind of plant. And then, of course, they have close to the surface, pretty easy gas exchange there. All right, so what I want to talk about here for floating leaf plants, this is a family of plants called Lemnaceae, and the common name are the duckweeds. And sure enough, this is a food for ducks and waterfowl. This is a group of flowering plants, believe it or not, but they are the world's smallest flowering plant. So this particular genus over here, Wolfia, you can see the relative size of these. Each of these little beads on there is its own plant. It's a flowering plant. When the conditions are right, they can flower and produce seeds. They do pollination. So I often tell people how much to keep an eye out for small plant features. These are really small plant features in Wolfia. A little bit bigger on this other illustration. You've got Wolfia plants interspersed with some of these other genera. So Lemna, so Wolfia doesn't have true roots. Lemna has some roots going on. And then a little bit bigger version, the Spirodella plant here. So kind of all doing the same thing, but at different, slightly different sizes. So I've got a little note on there. This is a family that's often classified in Araceae, and I've done some research on this group. And so it's a little bit more a personal issue for me to keep track of what to call this group. Let me zoom over here. Let's do this one. I guess maybe I'll give you the update. This is the newer version. This is a paper we had published in the last year, where we were making the case, as you can see from the title, that Lemnaceae should not be included in this family Araceae. And let me see if I can explain the issue to you. So this is a large family, Araceae. We'll talk about this family when we get to the large global plants, families that are large globally. This includes a lot of the house plants that you might have around your house. And it's a big family and diverse and certainly memorable. So people know this family. It's got distinctive morphological features. And the problem is that this family Lemnaceae was found to be kind of nested in within Araceae. This family I've got labeled as Orontiaceae. This is another family designation that's often not used. So this group, or basically we're promoting this name. So before we tried to promote this name, all these species were members of Araceae, and these were members of Araceae. So if you went to the common ancestor of Araceae, you would get here, and descended from that ancestor is also Lemnaceae, the duckweeds. So if you look at the people who are trying to put these big family categories together these days based on molecular DNA evidence, they usually come away and say, well, it's got a common ancestor with Araceae, therefore they have to be part of Araceae. And this paper that I'm highlighting here, we were trying to make the case, we'll see how much traction it gets. We were trying to make the case that the duckweeds can be maintained as their own family, Lemnaceae, separate from Araceae. And all that would take would be to elevate this little group of plants, and that's everybody. So it's not a large group of plants. This is all the members of that group. If we call them all Orontiaceae for this genus Orontium, then they become monophyletic, Lemnaceae monophyletic, Araceae monophyletic. So we'll see how that goes. But if you want to look up the family for duckweeds, you'll probably more likely than not find it still classified in Araceae. We'll see. Maybe you can root for us as the time goes on. Okay, so just a couple groups so far and individual members. These categories, there are more members in these categories than I've talked about, but we're just going to cover what I think are a memorable number of categories. So we talked about Nymphaeaceae for the floating leaf plants, Lemnaceae for the floating plants. And then this group, I'm just going to combine these together in the submersed plants, combine them together whether they are rooted or floating. So some of these plants don't have roots. Some of them actually don't even manufacture roots ever, but other ones are always rooted in the soil, at least when they get started. Sometimes they get dislodged and end up floating. And so it's maybe kind of not the most important designation, whether they're rooted or not at the moment. So that's why I split them into, or lump them into one category, submersed. So here's a group that has a little bit extra challenge. Everything we saw up to this point are plant groups that have access to the atmosphere. These plants are underwater. So to get their so-called gas exchange, there are options for them to get the chemicals they need to get those from the water. So there's dissolved oxygen, there's dissolved carbon dioxide, and these plants can make use of those. So we say gas exchange. You can also think about your aquatic plants, maybe not needing the gaseous version of those, but more like a dissolved version of oxygen, dissolved version of carbon dioxide. One thing I like to think about when I think about these aquatic plants underwater is that plants don't necessarily have to metabolize at any particular speed. So if you are limited for something that affects your growth as a plant, you can grow more slowly. So plants growing slowly, they don't necessarily suffocate. They can just kind of pause their metabolism or take that metabolism more slowly and not be, if you put an animal in the similar situation, it might be in trouble for running out of oxygen, but plants, not quite the same issues. All right, so here's an issue here of underwater carbon dioxide. One way that it's basically dissolved into water is as bicarbonate. So this can be used as a photosynthesis ingredient. So underwater aquatic plants probably get a lot of attention if you are looking for a summer job. Sometimes you can get a summer job surveying for aquatic weeds, or the land managers sometimes have people watch the boats as they exit water bodies and see what kind of underwater weeds they might be carrying with them. And so this is a pretty diverse group as far as ones that are people are interested in. So some of these you might have run into, you might be in a position later to encounter them. All right, so we covered a couple of groups that are at the family level. This is the first one we're just going to cover at the genus level. But again, it's kind of I don't know if it matters so much because this is a family that consists only of this genus. So however you want to learn it, I guess you could learn it as the family level, the genus name, or big bonus for the plants that people are learning at the genus level. I'm going to let you learn them as common names. So this one gets called hornwort, sometimes coontail, which I don't know which one has a little more prevalence. And this is an interesting plant group. This is one that is one of the earliest diverging flowering plants ever. So it's a very ancient group, if you want to think of it that way. This common name hornwort gives you a feel for what's going on with the leaves. The leaves kind of look like antlers, and they have this dichotomous branching. So as they branch out, these are dissected leaves, and they're splitting one into two, and then sometimes again into two. And these are actually the leaves. So the leaves are whorled. So follow them all to the base. There's quite a few of them all coming from the same location. This is what someone has carefully chopped the stem here to show these different leaves all coming off from the same place. Dissected, we kind of talked about dissected before, maybe. A dissected leaf is basically like you took a leaf, I'll maybe do one that isn't quite a hornwort. If you took a leaf with its veins, normally those veins are associated with a blade, right? If you took the leaf and you just reduced it down to basically only the veins, this is what we call dissected. And it's kind of an extreme version of being lobed. There's just no leaf blade. It's just reduced down to veins only. So dissected, you might think of a dissection, like something that's been cut. It's like you cut away all the leaf blade and you're left with the veins. This is something we see often in these submersed plants because it gives them a greater surface area. So as they're interacting with the, I should say, surface area to volume. Area to volume. Gives them more surface area to do that exchange of if they're getting carbon dioxide from the water or oxygen from the water or nutrients from the water. This maximizes that interaction with the water, and typically a feature you find in these underwater plants. So the fact that these are whorled and dichotomously dissected, very distinctive of this group. Hard to misplace this one if you know what you're looking for. Reproductively, this one is a plant that is monoecious, and it's got separate sex male and female flowers, and something that's rather rare in aquatic plants, it has the ability to pollinate underwater. So the parts I'm showing you here, these would be underwater on this plant. We have clusters of male flowers, so they release pollen, and that pollen actually does float, or flow, I should say, underwater to reach the female ovules. This is a developed ovule, pretty close to mature achene at this point, so spiny achene. The name here, ceratophyllum, so I have the common name here, hornwort. That's basically how that translates to. So wort is like a plant. It's cerato, horn, and phyllum is leaf. So I guess maybe hornleaf plant. Another underwater plant. This is a plant in a group that's got quite a few aquatic plants called Hydrokerataceae. I'm splitting apart the members of Hydrokerataceae because it's a little harder, if you're seeing them for the first time, it's a little harder to group them together. They have lots of different vegetative forms. So I'm going to take them separately as genera, and we'll do this one first, Elodea. Elodea has the common name of waterweed. And I think that's kind of par for the course for water plants. They don't often have very exciting common names. So waterweed. This is a plant that also has whorled leaves, but it has nice big leaf blades on there. So this is a whorl of 3 on this one, and this is blade, and the leaf shape is lanceolate, sometimes leaning a little more linear. And actually the teeth on plants in Hydrokerataceae, they tend to have teeth somewhere on their underwater leaves. So it's a little hard to see on here, but under a microscope, you'll be able to see the teeth on there. Even under a hand lens, you'd be seeing some leaf teeth on there. So this group, underwater, but in this case has flowers that open above water. So here's the water surface down here, emergent pedicel, and then here flower above the water. And you can see its parts, 1, 2, 3 petals. And so I have this question, is it a monocot or a eudicot? 1, 2, 3 petals would tell us that's monocot. And sure enough, these are monocots. So multiples of 3 for the petals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, I'm losing track here. Looks like 8, but maybe it's 9 stamens on there. Have to see. Can't quite tell. Okay, so Elodia, flowers above water, whorled leaves. Now we've got, still in Hydrokerataceae, another one. This is Najas, N-A-J-A-S. It's got the fun common name of water nymph. And this is a plant that also has those fine teeth on the leaves. You can see some here, but these leaves are opposite. So opposite leaves, a little bit more rare in the underwater plants, I think. Certainly a little unusual for a family to have sometimes whorled, sometimes opposite. So opposite leaves, again, pretty linear teeth on them. And then this one also does have underwater pollination. So this is an achene developing underwater with the style and stigma parts up there. So rare condition to be pollinated underwater. This is a independent origin of that strategy. Still in Hydrokerataceae, we have this plant called tape grass or eel grass. This has long, very long linear leaves. So this name tape grass is very apt, I think. So about 1 centimeter across, these long green leaves. There's some airspace that can sometimes help you to identify these. You can see the teeth on the leaf margins, especially towards the tip. And this group, the Vallisneria, these have a pollination strategy that happens at the water surface. So not underwater, not above water, but actually on the water surface. And they have separate male and female flowers. As you can see here, dioecious plants. So the male plant releases male flowers, actually release them underwater, but then they float to the surface. And this is a cluster of male flowers floating on the surface. So not much to them, but the grainy bits, that's the pollen. Here's an insect that fell into the water. But mostly flowers here, there's a little duckweed too. And they float on the water surface and they float toward where the female flowers are. And the female flowers, really lovely photo here, they just kind of sit at the water surface and create a little bit of a depression, and these male flowers fall into it. And all of this surface, this is all stigma. So lots of surface waiting to be contacted by the pollen. It's also got a kind of a feature where it's drawing the floating pollen containing flowers into the female flower for pollination. The female part, because it has to develop into fruits and seeds, it actually remains connected to the female plant, and you often get these spirally pedicels. So the stalks leading to the flowers, still connected to the female plant so that she can pump some nutrients into them, get you that nice feature just at the particular time of year when pollination happens. Another one, this is a big group, not many genera, but a whole bunch of species and lots of morphological diversity. These are the common name is pondweeds, super exciting. Their scientific name for the for the family is Potamogetaceae. So the family, based on this genus name, Potamogeton, means Potamo is river, like hippopotamus, and Geton is an inhabitant. So it's a river inhabitant for the genus name. Very often, mostly underwater, sometimes with floating leaves, depending on the species, also some variation within species. These leaves are alternate, and sometimes they're broad, sometimes they're linear, sometimes they're really, really fine leaves. One thing you can look for on these is that they produce these stipules. So these faint structures here, you can see they're coming from the nodes where leaves are attached. They're technically part of those leaves, and they basically surround the stem for a portion above where that leaf was attached, and sometimes they peel away like this. So knowing what to look for, if you see the stipules on these plants, they're single stipules. So we've seen stipules before that are 2 per leaf. This is 1 stipule per leaf. And depending on the leaf shapes, you might see different kinds of stipules, but they should be present if you know what to look for. I've got the floral formula up there. I would say you probably wouldn't identify these plants using the floral formula, but you can see that they're pretty reduced. We have separate carpels of four carpels per flower. Zooming in on the flowers themselves, this one is moving towards mature fruits. This one's a little bit more at the flower opening stage for pollination. Really nice illustration here. So separate carpels. These are some anthers here, and then some perianth parts. Not showy in particular. These are largely wind pollinated, I believe. And their inflorescence is a spike. So they're just up out of the water, spike, lots and lots of flowers, wind pollination, and then develop into these achenes. So another case where we have a water plant that's mostly underwater, but when it comes time for sexual reproduction, parts are above the water. And then those flowering structures become these fruiting structures. We've got nice illustrations here, sometimes rather large relative to the rest of the plant. And then a shape you often get with these achenes that are produced by single carpels. It's kind of teardrop shape with a little asymmetrical curl at the tip. So this is the leftover style from the flower. This is ovary, and then that just ovary to style often has this kind of curly tip going on. All right, so in Wisconsin, mostly species of Potamogeton. Also this species, or sorry, this genus called Stockenia. Doesn't really have an exciting common name on its own. Fine-leaved pondweed. Okay, next genus over. This one has some economic importance as contains a lot of invasive, or I guess a couple of really notorious invasive species. These are the water milfoils, and the scientific name for the genus is Myriophyllum or Myriophyllum, and that actually translates to basically thousands, myrio, a whole bunch of leaves. So it's not technically a whole bunch of leaves, but the leaves are divided, pinnately dissected. So this is one leaf, and it does look like it's got a lot going on. So it's feathery. It looks like feather you might get out of a down pillow or something. Mid-vein and a whole bunch of side veins coming off of that in pinnate fashion. So the pinnate venation is helpful for this group. They are whorled most of the time. There's a couple exceptions to that, but mostly whorled. And so that gives it this, this milfoil name. The milfoil is actually based on French. So mil for thousand and foil for leaf. So it's actually a pretty close translation to the genus name, Myriophyllum. Thousands of leaves, 1,000 leaf, and water milfoil. Some people just call them milfoils, but I think water milfoil is a little more informative. We're going to learn this as a genus, and it belongs to this family called Haloragaceae, which in fact contains some shrubs, but not around us in Wisconsin. So we don't have to worry about those. So we're going to just worry about the genus Myriophyllum. So leaves, very useful for identifying these. Sometimes these water plants, it's hard to get them at a time when you're actually going to see their reproductive structures. So water plants a lot of times are able to be identified just using their vegetative characteristics. And then if you get their reproductive characteristics, all the better. So we've got spikes again, and we've got unisexual or bisexual flowers. I'm sorry, scratch that, unisexual flowers. So we've got some female flowers lower down with their feathery stigmas, moving up to male flowers with the stamens produced on those. And then the fruit type, we didn't cover this one yet. The fruit type is called a schizocarp. And it's kind of like what we saw with aggregate. So if you have an aggregate fruit type. For those, we had flowers that had separate carpels. And then in fruit, they would all develop into their own, each carpel can become its own fruit. And this is one of the terms you can use for those dry indehiscent fruits you get from a aggregate. The situation with a schizocarp. So carp we've seen before. Carp is for fruit, and the schizo part is broken. So schizophrenic is a term referring to basically a broken or fractured mind. Schizocarp is a fractured fruit. So I'm going to try to draw something similar to what we saw in the water milfoil flowers. So it's a syncarpous gynoecium, whereas over here in aggregate we had apocarpus. And the difference is that as this fruit matures, it can break apart. So it kind of matures into one structure, but then it has these seams on it that can break apart into separate nutlets. So the end result is the same. You still end up with nutlets, but the starting point is different. The starting point for a schizocarp was a unified syncarpous gynoecium with one ovary, and it's just the ovary breaks apart. So maybe a fine difference. Sometimes on these, you can see this flat area here. The nutlet has a flat surface where it was pressed against the other nutlets, and then a round surface where it was toward the outside. So you can kind of reconstruct this if you see the shape of a nutlet from a schizocarp. Okay, moving on to emergent plants. Emergent plants are ones you're probably familiar with, at least some of these. We'll start off with a family called Alismataceae, named for this genus Alisma. It's also the same genus as the arrowheads in the genus Sagittaria. So Sagittaria, similar if you're into astrological signs, Sagittarius is the archer. And so Sagittaria actually refers to this being an arrowhead. This is a group of monocots. You can see with the multiples of 3, so 3 sepals, 3 petals, multiples of 3, at least for some of these in the stamens and carpels. And a little bit different. It's sort of a parallel venation here, but heading in a couple opposite directions. So parallel venation mostly on the Sagittaria. The Alisma, much more parallel venation, kind of classical parallel venation. So a few different leaf shapes, sometimes with this arrowhead shape, which we call sagittate, sometimes more rounded, sometimes linear. One thing that's useful for these are the flowers are in whorls. So either branches of the inflorescence or the flowers themselves are produced in whorls. You can see these in the inflorescence. Definitely helpful for this genus Alisma, also present in Sagittaria. And the inflorescence, a raceme or panicle. And then I guess emergent to different degrees. So this one is an emergent plant, but it's largely underwater here. But of course, the much more elaborate flowering structure is a little different from what we saw in the submersed plants. So this plant being rooted near the water surface can give it more ability to support a large inflorescence like this. Here are a variety of flowers, so unisexual or bisexual. Those monocot characteristics of 3 sepals, 3 petals. And here we've got Alisma that's bisexual with carpels in the center, stamens toward the outside, so 6 stamens, multiple of 3. Sagittaria has a case here where we've got male flowers and female flowers, so stamens only, and then this one is like a globe of carpels, a whole bunch of separate carpels all smashed together there. Alisma has this kind of ring of achenes. So this is an aggregate fruit type. And then, as I mentioned with Sagittaria, a much more dense collection of carpels still developing into achenes. So 2 cases of aggregate fruit type. Here are the ones that you might find in Wisconsin: Alisma, Sagittaria. This group is diverse worldwide, but these are our big players in the state here. Next family up. All right, so we did family Alismataceae. Now we'll do family Typhaceae. This family didn't always include this one on the right here, but these have been merged together. The family Typhaceae, named for Typha, that's the genus of cattails, and also includes this genus called Sparganium burr reeds. And they have a lot in common. So these are emergent plants with linear leaves. It's kind of the most characteristic emergent wetland plant I can think of, really. If you're going to illustrate a wetland, you probably got some cattails on it. So leaves, pretty distinctive. As we'll see, of course, you might confuse these for grasses, but when you get to the inflorescence, that's definitely a giveaway for this group. So cattails and burr reeds. And these, as we will see, are monoecious plants. So monoecious plants with unisexual flowers, male flowers and female flowers, both produced on the same plant. The Sparganium plants, burr reed, have these more globes of flowers. So these are globes of female flowers developing into each separate fruits, one fruit per flower. And then this is globes of male flowers all clustered together, producing and distributing pollen. These are more obviously separated on the Sparganium plants. On cattails in the genus Typha, you might not have noticed this part before, but often you see a cattail, like an illustration of a cattail, that's got, sorry, I'm supposed to be more upright. If you got a stalk for your inflorescence, and then the cattails have that little thing sticking up at the top, right? So this part in the fruiting part of the plant, this is where the fruits develop. So wind dispersed fruits, but this little cap at the top here, what was that? Well, that was the leftover, kind of a scar of what used to be present as this collection of male flowers. So early in the season, pretty early in the spring, you get these plants with their male flowers together on the same reproductive axis as the female flowers. So we have female flowers now still waiting to be pollinated, male flowers distributing their pollen. And then later those female flowers develop into the fruits, and the male flowers just fall off, giving you that naked stalk later. Okay, the last few, these I'm just going to go through. These are ones for my class. You don't have to know these, but I'm hoping to maybe introduce you to some groups that you have a more comprehensive sense for what plants you can find in the state. So rapid fire here. This is another one of the floating leaved plants. This is called water shield, genus Brasenia. These have floating leaves that are attached at their center. That's kind of rare. So if you flip these over, you'd see the petiole attaches right here. Another thing on the underside of these leaves is they're very slimy, like a slick, slimy surface on the underside. They're close relatives, not too distant from the water lilies. So we do have lots of perianth parts, lots of stamens, and of course the floating leaves also, they have that in common. Underwater, this is one called Elatony. This has opposite leaves. This is a I don't know what to say. It's related to, I'm trying to remember, it's related to plants that are definitely not as basal as the water lilies. Elatony, this is one with the opposite leaves. You might find underwater. I don't have any images of flowers that you could really discern on these images. Other one with floating leaves is the water lotus. Also lots in common with the water lily, so lots of perianth parts, lots of stamens, but it has this fused syncarpous gynoecium that's a little bit different. It's kind of a shape all onto its own, this flat top, and then these are individual locations where the stigmas are, and those develop independently into their own fruits. An emergent plant here, this is one called pickerel weed pontidaria. Nice monocot features here, so good parallel venation on these emergent leaves. This coloration is pretty common across the whole family. Pontederiaceae, I guess this color, or sometimes yellow, but pretty distinctive. You might run into these pickerel weeds. Here's another one. Sorry, I mentioned they were yellow. Here's our yellow example. This is also family Pontederiaceae. This one is Heteranthera. This one can grow on mudflats, as you see here. It's also one that grows pretty well as an open water, floating under the water surface plant with the emergent flowers when it comes time to flower. Nice monocot number of petals there. Heteranthera. This one, a fairly close relative of the pondweeds in its own family, Rupiaceae. This is a family that enjoys a little more saline conditions. So not so much in Wisconsin, but some parts of the country that have more ocean influence, marine influence. You can see this plant growing in kind of brackish waters that are salty. Might run into it in Wisconsin. All right, so a few aquatic plants here. Hope you enjoyed that.